Dr. Baumel. He's really a fine gentleman.
Yes,
and then
yes,
also more recently, Robert Heilbronner.
Oh, yes.
He had written
yes.
that book, The Worldly Philosophers, which I think is really readable for the layman to try and understand economics and trying to understand the science.
I think it's one of the best-selling economics books ever.
I think, yeah.
Maybe the best.
And he's an awfully nice man.
He is.
Yeah,
He's a real gentleman.
Yeah. So, and we're glad to be able to talk with you. Welcome very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Edward Wolff. And Dr. Wolff's at the Starr School, I believe, at New York University, and is a professor of economics at New York University. And Dr. Wolff, welcome very much. Is that correct, the Starr or the?
Well, the Starr Center.
Starr Center, but it's
it's a part of the economics department.
And it's also MBA, and I saw on the internet that you've just been awarded one of the 10 best in the whole United States. And they were giving kudos to that center, and we congratulate you and your colleagues on it, and one of them being Mr. Baumel. We were just chatting. He was here a few months ago, but in any event, welcome very much to Conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
We're going to be talking about you and the work that you study, the particular area of interest that you have, which is disparity of wealth, or the tendencies of wealth in the society, American world society. And I want to show right at the outset, if we could, this is a book that was published. You can just see it on the screen. This is called Top Heavy. It was published by the 20th Century Fund, and it's subtitled A Study of the Increasing Inequality of Wealth in America. And this is put out, as we say, by the 20th Century Fund recently, and a great deal of work that's been treating of this subject, and we're going to want to talk about that with you. But I wonder if maybe you could, at the outset here, maybe you could share some of your own background, where you were born and raised, that sort of thing, your education, how you got into the economics field, and then we want to go into depth, because you are perhaps, I would say, the best that we have in the United States in terms of understanding how we can get a quantitative measurement of what the reality is in terms of the evolving wealth and wealth disparity that there exists within the society. But could you share some of your own background?
Well, I was born in New Jersey, not far from here, and I grew up in Tarrytown, New York, which again is not far from here, one of the suburbs in Westchester. And then I went to undergraduate school at Harvard, and there I became interested in economics, mainly because of an interest in the political and social events of that time. This was during the 1960s. First there was the Civil Rights Movement, and then of course the war in Vietnam, and this created a great deal of interest in social and political issues, and from there it was an easy step into economics, since many of the problems emanate from economic factors.
Yes, indeed, they did then, and they do now.
And they still do, absolutely
right.
right.
Seems that way to me, too.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
And that was an amazing time, wasn't it?
It
Bobby
was.
Dylan used to say, there's something blowing in the wind, and the times they are changing, and there was a lot of people who agreed with him. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be a weatherman to know which way the wind's blowing.
We got our lesson. We got our, yes, indeed, yeah. Well, it's good that you got to economics in that milieu. It came out of social concern and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so that was my primary motivation. I was interested in social and political problems, and that's what spurred an interest in economics. Then after leaving Harvard, I actually floated around for a couple of years. I taught high school for a year and did some research work. Worked for Vasily Leontiev.
Oh dear, yes, he just passed recently.
Yeah, he was a great man.
He was a wonderful man and a wonderful human being.
Yeah.
We did an interview with him about 1974 up at his place in Vermont.
Really?
Oh, he made us so welcome. It was wonderful, and that I was really very, very sorry to see it pass.
Yeah,
for the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. And he was, well, he actually taught until he was 91.
God bless that man.
He kept going.
And he had a great spirit. He had a great and a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
He said to me, we did the second one with him, and he said, this is 10 years, and now it looks like we will have to do another one in a decade from now. And he was really a great person. You studied with him then?
I studied
he was
with
at
him.
Harvard?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, he was at Harvard
Yeah.
then, and he was what they called my tutor.
Oh, right. Okay. Good.
And under him, I read actually I read some Karl Marx and Schumpeter and some of the other great classical thinkers
Yes.
at that time. The classical economists were much more interested in the political context of economics.
Yeah,
and
it's called political economy by
and
a
that's
lot of
what it
people,
was.
didn't it?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
It was called political economy for the
Mm.
reason that it was motivated by political issues.
Mm. Yeah. Had you, if I may, I don't mean to, but did you? We were just chatting beforehand that Mr. Heilbronner had written that book that has introduced so many people to economics that some deridingly call the dismal science, introduced them to where they could understand it, but the worldly philosophers. Had you read that?
Oh, yes,
Did
yes.
it help introduce you to the discipline?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I read that as a freshman. I took introductory economics as a freshman, and that book was a big factor in my decision to become to study economics.
Yeah.
It was very stimulating
Yeah.
piece of work, and again, it presented economics in the context of these broader social concerns.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah, and that's
And there's a new edition out now.
yes, yes.
It's 7th, I think, or maybe it's the 11th, I'm not sure. but it has a new chapter added. He had ended the last one with the consideration of Mr. Schumpeter, and then he would go on, and the last one was that he thought the last chapter is that he thinks economics is trying to become too scientific and not broad enough, taking in anthropology in a more comprehensive understanding. It was a plea that he had in the last chapter of the newest edition of it.
Yes, yes, and I think he's exactly right. The discipline has become very analytical and mathematical. It's become overtaken by the physics model, that the only true science is kind of analytical and mathematical discipline that physics is. And I think as a result, it's lost a lot of its broader context. And it doesn't really lend itself that easily to mathematical methods.
It does not.
No, no. It's because the categories themselves are so loose and effervescent.
Okay.
Physics, you have very distinct categories. You have mass, you have velocity, you have light, you have so on. And, you know, these categories have been around for billions of years.
Yes,
they don't
indeed.
change.
They have been, right, yeah.
And when you have simple categories and they interact in fairly stable fashions, again, they've interacted the same way for billions of years.
That's right, yeah.
Then that kind of...
you can get real laws that are laws.
right,
Yeah,
exactly.
right. Yeah.
But economics, the categories themselves are very slippery and they change over time. What is capital, for example? That has changed over time. What is a market? That has changed. Look, with e-commerce, we have a whole new conception of what the marketplace is.
Right, yeah.
So we live I mean, economics is a discipline where the basic categories themselves are not stable over time.
That's right, 'cause the human condition isn't stable.
Exactly. And
the input, Mr. Leonte used to have input-output theorizing and so forth, but the input to actually what we call production, the various inputs to production in their ratios to that production might change with time. For instance, technology is more and more relevant than it was 100, 200 years ago.
yeah, yeah, that's exactly correct.
Yeah.
Technology has become a much more important factor in explaining economic phenomena today than it was in Ricardo's time or
Yes.
Smith's time,
Yeah, right.
200, 250 years ago.
Yeah, Mr. Heilbronner suggests that's when it began. The discipline began in 1776 with The Wealth of Nations.
That's right. Of the two great events of that year,
Yes.
it may be that the Wealth of Nations in the long run has turned out to be the more important one.
Might well be, although I think the steam engine sometimes, I'm not sure, maybe I'm wrong on that. The invention of the steam engine was a big a big thing about that sometime. But it's only a couple hundred years then that we've had this discipline that now, and we were just chatting before, that it's become, and I agree with you, that the major questions in terms of the polity and the social organizing of the planet is really economics.
Yeah, I still think it's really the underlying force behind much of the political and social change that we've seen. You know, Marx himself said it was the dominant force in modern society. And I think he was quite correct in that regard.
He was a man of great vision, was he not? I mean,
he is. You know,
as a sociologist or as an observer, he was one of the greats. I mean, back to Mr. Haubroner again for a second. He was one of the 12 or so that he highlights that were the greats in the field of economics that gave us understanding. Or
yes, yes, absolutely. And I think you can go back and read Marx today and still get a lot of insights about the workings of capitalism. So he's not just an historical figure, but his thoughts are still very much au courant.
Yeah, right.
Very relevant to what's going on today.
Well, we could just take a minute with that, because we had a world before. I mean, we now have a world of there's a great deal of triumphalism about the defeat of the Soviet Union and the downfall of the Marxian analysis. You know, they will say, Mr. Fukuyama writes a book about the end of history and that sort of thing, that it's over, that we're going to have, the world is going to be operated by a market economy. We've won, in a certain sense, that battle since the fall of the Soviet Union. You want to comment on that?
Well, first of all, I think Marx himself, his main work was really an analysis of capitalism. He actually didn't spend much time writing about socialism.
Right. Yeah, right.
It was still not there. And
he saw the tremendous power of capitalism.
And he absolutely did. And I think if you read Marx today, you'll see that his main emphasis was on technological change as the main motor of capitalism. And that has certainly been the case. And of course, Schumpeter was also carried forth that idea.
Yeah.
But it was original to Marx. You don't find that in Adam Smith or David Ricardo or anyone before him.
Okay.
This notion that it's technological change that's the main force behind economic and thereby social change.
That's really interesting, because it is indeed that. Particularly now, we were just talking about e-commerce and the technology is coming now, and it came the internet and everything came just 5 years or something, and it seems to be these things are coming almost at exponential speeds. The technological transformation and those expressions of technology, extensions of consciousness. Marshall McLuhan or James Joyce would have said. They're extensions of consciousness, and they have effects back on the way we actually see and are working in the world. And those technologies are, the technological and scientific and technological advancement is moving at such an incredible, almost exponential pace in its capability of bringing new power to whatever it is we collectively come to decide it is we want to do with this planet Earth of ours.
Yeah. No, it's still the primary force of change, and I think you're right that the pace has really accelerated, certainly over the last 100 years.
Go ahead. Yeah.
But the other thing that Marx emphasized was the implicit class struggle that was part of implicit in capitalism. That is, it wasn't just that there was technology, and that by itself changed everything, but that there was a working class, and workers didn't necessarily gain from this new technology. And I think this was an idea that was very powerful at the time, and was one of the main factors that led to communism. And it's still with us today. We still have not gone beyond this basic notion of class struggle.
Yeah,
really.
and your work ties into that. I wonder just one thing on that. They have a, he had, if I'm not mistaken, set me right if I'm wrong, or not off base or don't understand, but he had this idea, or the Marx had this idea of, you know, that this labor, or he had surplus value, the surplus value of labor, that everything comes from labor, and that the capital is stolen labor. I think they called it congealed labor. It was all labor, and that the capital owners, the ones who owned the technology, was in a certain sense part of an evil institution being private property, because the few owned the technological instruments, but all sorts of income, all sorts of production, or we call it now productivity, and we're very linked to the idea of productivity as a way of gauging the economy, comes from labor. And that the labor theory of value is something that's been very, very important in terms of trying to judge it, or how do we deal? Am I correct in that?
Yeah.
And does it also apply over to classical thinking, that in general they tend to do that? Our grounding policy statement in the United States is the Employment Act of 1946, where we're going to distribute income by labor criteria, even though the technology, maybe much of it disembodied, is increasingly responsible for production and is owned by relatively few. But we concentrate on the jobs, and we're very happy now because the unemployment's down, everybody's employed. But that more to the point of this notion of congealed labor.
Yeah.
That capital was congealed labor and therefore an evil institution in a certain sense. Is that right? The way you saw it?
Yeah. I think the term was the exploitation of labor. That this brings us to the last few decades in the United States. I mean, because what's happened is since the early 1980s, and I can even date it at 1982.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why in a second.
Okay, good.
We've seen, despite the expansion of the economy, despite the low unemployment rate, but we've seen the share of income shifting away from labor and towards capital. And now profit rates are almost at an all-time high. Corporate profit rate has increased by more than 50% since 1982.
Okay.
And you know, this ties into a number of factors, but one of them is the strike of the air controllers in 1982.
Yeah, Reagan broke the back of the union movement with that, did he not?
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And I think that was the signal that Washington was no longer going to be friendly to labor. And so you see the shift towards supporting capital, even at the expense of labor. And this was a very major change in sort of the political economy of the country. You know, during the preceding few decades, we saw a steady growth of wages. We saw basically an even split between workers and capital in terms of the gains from productivity. So there was a sharing of the fruits of technological change. And you know, that was the era when we had strong unions. Remember?
I know. I'm from Detroit. I remember. Yeah.
And when the steel workers threatened to strike, or United Auto Workers, we used to have presidents go in there and try to.
Kennedy did against the steel industry.
Yeah.
But it was the industry itself.
Even Eisenhower, Dunlop.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah.
So you know, labor was strong, and there was kind of a modus vivendi worked out, where I think labor and capital decided to split the gains of our rising productivity.
Yeah. And we'd had Taft-Hartley, and we'd had the labor laws that came out of the Depression and the Roosevelt era and that sort of thing. And the labor was still, the labor contribution to the production was still great. I mean, if you draw that analogy back, if you go instead of in the 30s, 40s, 50s, golden era, maybe 60s, of labor's role in terms of the American society, but if you go back in terms of this capital and labor input to production, you go back to, say, Tom Jefferson. Let's go back to 1776 again. But if you go back to that time, and if you were to try and draw a an understanding of how much of, instead of saying productivity, which we tend to use, we were talking about productiveness. So you're going to create it. You have a cobbler, and he's going to make a pair of boots, and there are no machines or anything much. There's a hammer, and it takes him 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours to fashion the pair of boots. Great deal of labor went into that. Labor was really responsible for what was being done. It was the labor cutting down all those trees and things to clear the forest. It was labor because the technology simply wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
But now, if you, so I don't know, I've seen some estimates where maybe 10% of the actual production was the result of technology, the hammer,
Mm-hmm.
and 90% was labor, you know, in terms of what was being done. And then I've seen projections where they went and they say, we may have just reversed those now.
Mm.
That the actual production, particularly as we start looking at automated systems and so forth, the actual production is maybe 90% something other than labor, and only 10% is the responsibility for, is labor, and yet we distribute practically all income by labor criteria.
Mm.
The technology is owned by, what, 5, 10% at the outside or
Yeah.
something in any kind of depth. So the ownership of the technology is very, very narrowly held. But can we get at a measurement of how much of the production is technology, or how much of it is something other than labor, and how much is labor, or do we have a clear understanding of that or not? And what I'm getting at, I guess, is it appropriate to have a labor theory of value as a way of distributing income, or do we need something else to where it's in tune with the way things are actually being produced, particularly as we look ahead, these algorithms with cybernetic and automated capability of providing without the need of the labor input.
Yeah, well, labor may suddenly become obsolete.
It may indeed. Well, no, or it may be redundant, or they'll be able to do things increasingly because these computer systems are becoming so incredibly productive.
Yeah, but on the other hand, labor is still needed in certain industries, like luckily education, which is my my industry.
Yes, thank goodness they need professors, right? Yeah, right. Although
they've tried to, you know, that's interesting. They've tried to replace professors or teachers with programmable instructions, and
or they have in Britain. I just saw it was I thought the magic year was 1970 myself, but the magic year that the British Open University got started, and I see they're coming now into the United States, the Open University. The British Open University is coming where you take the best mind in any particular discipline and make it widely available.
Yeah, yeah.
Like you. You, with all due respect, you should be widely available to a whole national audience, and because they could get to the best, in a sense, you know, in terms of that field.
But
or Mr. Ballmer or Mr. Hybro.
Yeah. But it's still curious that by and large, education is still performed the same way it was performed probably 2,000 years ago. You have a classroom, and you have students, and you have a teacher.
Yeah, probably that's probably true. And I was probably thinking of the economy as a whole, you know. Although I've had people tell me, and they tell me I don't want to talk too much here, but they tell me that it's really true, honestly true, that the airlines, and it's just sort of a metaphor, but the airlines, American Airlines, we fly around and everything, they would be more efficient and cost effective, and most of all, safer if there was no pilot. Triple redundancy systems make them so, but we got to have the gray-haired man and fall back. Because do you understand what I'm saying? But if that were true, it could be somehow measured and put represented. You got human failure, human error, human emotions and things that get in the way. It'd be safer if they weren't there doing these things. But we have no other way to distribute income because the ownership is all held by a handful of people.
Yeah.
They never concentrate on expanding the ownership. But that's another issue, perhaps. And I heard you say that the disparity since 1982 of income, but also of wealth, and there's a distinction between income and wealth. And what are the trends that we can see? It's becoming very concentrated at the top in your perception.
Yeah, well, this is despite widespread reports that we have now entered people's capitalism.
Yes.
That's the new catchword.
Yeah.
Now, it is true that higher percentage of households do own some stock today than they did, let's say, 20 years ago.
Okay.
In fact, as many as 49% of all households have some stock ownership.
Is that also through pension plans and
That
through
includes pension
mutual
plans,
funds?
mutual funds, yeah.
But it's pretty narrow, pretty...
Well, that's the point, that a lot of these people all have very small stock holdings, you know, 5 or 10,000. So it gives the illusion, though, that you know, there's no longer a conflict between labor and capital because everyone's become a capitalist.
Yeah,
you see.
and that is decidedly not the case.
That's right. Yeah.
It is decided, and we should spell that out. I mean, people will say,
yeah.
with this mutual funds, everything's going great. Everybody can become an investor, and they can reap. That's not the case.
That's absolutely not the case.
Would there be some people who try to argue that is the case for political or other reasons?
Well, but people will look at that 49% number and say, "Hey, look, everyone is becoming a capitalist."
Yeah,
There's
lifts
no
all
longer-
boats, huh? Lifts.
No longer a conflict now between labor and capital. But you know, the point is that while the average family, middle-income family, owns on average about $10,000 worth of stock, the upper income class, that's people with $100,000 or more, own on average $150,000 worth of stock. So that's 15 times as much.
And if you just watch Bill Gates, they've got a website that just tracks it. It's absurd. And Mr. Allen.
Bill Gates alone owns as much wealth as approximately 45% of all Americans.
Is it really that?
Yeah, yeah.
I had seen a figure, maybe you could set me straight. It was 248 people in the world have a net worth, or I'm not sure how they measure it, that represented something like the net worth of 48% of the population of the world or something. There were 250 odd people or something.
Yeah, that's believable.
Is that possible?
Yeah.
That's really incredible concentration of wealth and income, right?
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely true. That the illusion that that wealth is spreading out throughout, well, our society and then maybe throughout the world is really an illusion.
Is an illusion.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, if anything, it's becoming more concentrated at the top.
Yeah. And the trends are just troubling in that way?
Yeah, again, we can date it from the early 1980s, for wealth in particular. Income disparities, we date that a little bit earlier, maybe the mid to late 1970s, but both have gone on an upward trajectory since that time, and really accelerated in the 1980s.
Yeah, and continue.
It's continued through, let's say, in terms of income, it's continued through maybe 96, 97. It's leveled off in the last few years in terms of income.
Yeah.
But in terms of wealth, it's still rising.
Yeah, and is it important to what we mean when we say wealth, and how we define what we mean by wealth, and that some wealth is really available, I mean, that can be converted into, let's say, how do we define what wealth is? Some wealth is convertible immediately into income, or how do we define what we mean when we say wealth?
Yeah,
it's an important question, I think.
Yeah. And it's a good question because most people don't know, at least how economists define wealth, and we mean the assets that people own. It includes housing, if you own your own home. It includes other types of real estate. It includes bank accounts, checking accounts, money market funds, stocks and bonds, mutual funds. If you own your own business, it includes the value of that business. And it includes various pension accounts, like IRAs and 401ks. And then from that, we subtract out what people owe, their debt. The main source of debt is mortgage debt on your home. And then there are other kinds of debt, auto loans, credit card balances, other kinds of consumer loans.
Right.
And that difference is what we mean by wealth or net worth.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes
Is it a standard agreement on how that is measured, or the way you measure that would give you different results in terms of it?
yeah,
And
there's
how much of that of those things you ticked off can be converted to cash, or how do you define what it is? Like a automobile could be something that you're not going to be able to get something for. Or,
yeah. Now that's sort of one of those borderline issues. Do you
and is
include
it
the-
important? I mean,
It makes a little bit of a difference.
Okay.
Yeah, you get, if you include automobiles in your measure of wealth, you get a slightly smaller concentration ratio. You can include other kinds of consumer durables, as we call them. You include furniture and TVs and appliances, because in a sense all of these have some kind of resale value. But they're not very liquid, as you said.
Yeah, they're not liquid. But on the whole, we understand what we mean when we're talking about wealth and how we get at net value and that kind of thing. We have an agreement among the economists, because there is some disagreement among economists who will look at our economy or our situation. There's you who will say there's a problem of there being disparity between the well-to-do and it's growing, and as you say, the study of the increasing inequality of the American economy. And there are other economists who will look at the figures, or they'll look at the facts, and our presidential candidates, and they'll look and they say everything's hunky-dory. Now, what is the lay citizen to think, and how do we get at some sort of a quantitative thing to where we can get at what the reality is?
Well, to be immodest, they should read my work.
Yes, I will second and third and fourth that. They should. And I was quite serious that your work should be out to a whole wide audience and be understanding to repair. But you understand what I'm getting at. You'll have colleagues within the field, and they can come to different conclusions, much less the politically motivated, what do you call them, or not, the boosters and that kind of thing. You know, they're saying everything's great.
Yeah, well, you know, there are some people who look at the numbers and say, well, you know, there's not really an upward trend, you know, just because things do wiggle around a little bit over time.
And this is the greatest economy we've ever had. You see all the president and Mr. Gore and everybody saying this is the greatest economy we've ever had, and let's share this prosperity, let's build on this prosperity. Let's not change anything. Let's not talk about things. There are some disaffected people, but do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah.
No, that's absolutely true, and it's true that the last 2 or 3 years, inequality, at least of income, has moderated. It hasn't really gone up, but it's taken, you know, an incredibly lowering of the unemployment rate to finally get wages to rise a little bit at the bottom. You know, because wages have been basically stagnant for almost over 25 years.
Is that true? The wages have been stagnant, you think?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is what's so...
the figures are all right from commonly agreed figures. Yeah?
Those figures, yeah, are indisputable. Yeah,
all right,
they're from our U.S. Bureau of the Census, and they're from our U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. These are, you know, government agencies, but they're independent. They're set up as independent agencies. They're not under the direct influence of the president or of the executive branch.
Right, because yeah.
So no, these numbers are pretty much indisputable. That
well, that's good. We've got that because we have a congressional budget office. We have different kinds of people and different political, you know, ways of looking at things, and we want you know, because that's important that we can understand and trust the figures. We need standard agreed to figures. Yeah.
That's exactly true. We need some kind of nonpartisan organization that will produce these figures, so we all have some common ground to discuss these issues.
And we want to trust, and by and large, we want to trust government sources for those figures.
Well,
they have a certain disinterest, or some people would say the government has an interest in moving the society in a certain way or something.
Yeah, I mean,
you count things.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, they would try to show things are rosier than they are.
That they got that, right.
Yeah.
Sure,
but,
to get reelected.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, they want to milk the figures as much as they can.
Right.
But, you know, if the official figures show that wages have been flat, you know, you can pretty much believe that's the case.
Also, the way they measure unemployment. Some people would say they changed the standard by which they measure unemployment so that if you have a 4% now unemployment, that in another time it would have been 8% or it would have been more. They're fudging the figures, they're changing. Have those figures of measuring that stayed consistent with a within a certain range that make them valid through time to get, you know, comparative readings and so forth?
Yeah, by and
think they
large,
have?
yeah. The unemployment rate statistic has been pretty stable over time.
It hasn't been fudged.
No. But you know what is going on, and sometimes is hidden from public view, is that our definition of the labor force excludes what we call the institutional population. Prisons, yeah.
It's the biggest growth industry we've got,
Absolutely.
Is it not?
We are now up to 2 million.
2 million and growing.
And we are now have the highest incarceration rate in the advanced industrial world, and probably second only to Russia.
Really?
Yeah.
I'll be doing. Yeah, and growing, right?
And growing. And we have you know, California is now spending more money on prisons than it is on education.
Yeah, I had one person say if it wasn't for that, she figured how many, you got one incarcerated people and you've got how many people that service the incarcerated people, you probably got, with people supplying food and getting things to go for that, you probably got 5 or something, and you'd probably have you got 2 million, you got 3 million, you're going to have a factory, you're going to have, you know, 15 million people that would be unemployed that are servicing the service end. We would be in terrible figures if it wasn't that we had everybody locked up, you know, that kind of thing, which is a sort of sad way to do it. But then that's probably tied into the war on drugs and that sort of thing. And
yeah, but from a statistical point of view, it cuts about 2 percentage points off the unemployment rate.
Right, that's
because if these people were on the streets, they probably wouldn't be working, and so the unemployment rate would be instead of 4%, it would be 6%.
So lock them up, huh? I mean, well, that's another issue. But so we got that, and the thing we're talking around it. So we got income, we got wealth, and then we've got also the fact that people used to have employment. That in my good old day, my grandfather was a union organizer of the lithographers and things in Detroit, and it all came up. But they used to have jobs that were they weren't temps. They weren't temporary. They had benefits. They had a whole lot of things that went along with them, and they had a longer term prospect in terms of holding a particular job and that sort of thing. Things are moving very quickly now, and there's a lot of young people, and they're brought in and hired. They had a lot of downsizing in the 80s with a lot of senior management people and that sort of thing, and then they brought young people in at a lot less cost, and they didn't give them benefits. They didn't have a security. They don't have collective security yet adequately or something. So the jobs that they have don't have all the kind of social cohesive capability that the traditional jobs did or something. Is there any point of talking about that?
No, that's the other side. When we talk about income, we exclude all these other fringe benefits, and that's the other thing that happened.
Gone for great numbers of people.
Yeah, if they've taken away the what we sometimes call the primary labor market jobs that provided these good benefits, health insurance, pensions, vacation time, and now they've substituted them with hourly jobs that don't carry any benefits with them. And so, you know, we have a health insurance crisis in this country. We have 17% of the population without any kind of health coverage.
Right.
And this includes a lot of working people. There
are working people who are in poverty.
Well, there are working people who are in
poverty line.
Yeah,
they're working 40 hours a week. There are some people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, because the minimum wage is $5.25 an hour, and you work 40 hours a week, 50 weeks. That barely gives you $10,000, and the poverty line for a family of 4 is $16,000.
All right.
So,
right.
You know,
and it used to be.
That's a big change. If you were at the minimum wage in 1968,
all right,
you would be above the poverty line.
And now, if you are, you would be you'd be
Well
below it?
well
below it.
Yeah.
So that's
yeah.
an indicator right there. And it used to
Absolutely.
be back in the good old days, the 40s, 50s, one guy would go out and work at the Chrysler factory or something. He'd raise a family of 5 with his wife taking care of all the things at home.
Right.
Now they go out, and if they want to have a career, great, but they go out and because they have to meet the mortgage payments and so on. You got 2 people working for what? It used to be handled by 1.
Yeah, and that's the other side of the story, with wages flat, and actually wages have declined at the bottom half of the distribution.
Mm-hmm.
Just take the bottom half of workers, their average wage today is about 15% lower than it was in 1973.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
That much?
15%, yeah.
Uh-huh. In
inflation adjusted.
Yeah, right, okay. Yeah.
So, you know, the only thing that's kept family income stable, and family income has been pretty stable, is that wives have gone out into the labor market.
Mm-hmm. Well, we should get Fagin again and get the kids. We should get the kids
Well,
out there. You know, we should get rid of these, you know, get those little 8-year-olds out there working and breaking up coal. Or something. You know,
bring Charles,
Charles
Dickens
bring back Dickens now that we need him, right? You know, but I mean, no, there's a thing to that. But this is a thing that is not. I'm trying. You write on that, and in general, for your perception, the inequalities that exist within the economy are patent. I mean, are obvious and are part of the thing. Are part of the trends are not good. And it's something that we, the citizenry and the policymakers, should understand better than we do?
Yeah, or at least bring attention to it. Don't throw it under the rug, which is, you know, even in this current campaign, no one is really addressing the inequality issue per se.
Some people seem to think, you know, you got some of the pundits, Arianna Huffington just wrote a book saying how to create a revolution or something, and that the people who were from McCain, a lot of the people, there's discontent in the middle. There are some people saying, and that there might be a political group. But why is it that this has happened, in your estimation? What has caused this to happen since you marked it 1982? I don't know if that was PAPCO or what it is.
Yeah. Well,
and what is it that caused it? Was it the supply side, or was it, you know, what caused this to happen? And if this is a deleterious, what should we do about it? How can we address it?
Well, it's there. As
we only have a few minutes, unfortunately.
Yeah, many of these things are. There are a number of factors. We economists always like to say, "Oh, there are a number of factors."
Yeah, that's right.
One, of course, which I mentioned before, is that unions have greatly declined in importance. They used to represent 1/3 of workers back in the 50s. Now they represent only 12% of the labor force.
Then the question that would come from that is why?
Why? Well, again, it's
well,
fairly
there's many
complex.
factors.
No, 4 or 5 factors as well.
It's like the challenge, why is the sky blue? Yeah. Political?
Yeah, this will. Well, part of it's political. Part of it is that the heart of the union movement was in manufacturing, and manufacturing has really been severely has severely contracted in this country.
And much is going overseas?
Much of it has been outsourced to other countries. Yeah. So we've had a big decline in our core industries like steel for sure, rubber, chemicals, automobiles to some extent. So we've lost a lot of the hardcore manufacturing jobs, which was sort of the heart of the union movement. But part of it is I think this shift in political ideology that unions really have a bad rap in this country. You know, things were sort of tainted by Jimmy Hoffa and
union bosses.
And
the right to work laws.
And cries of feather bedding.
Yes, right.
And of course these things did go on, but that wasn't you know, that wasn't the main task of the union. It was very marginal to the union movement as a whole. So you know, unions have gotten a bad rap, and part of it is political. I think when Reagan said, you know, Washington is no longer going to support labor.
Fired all those PAPCO guys?
They fired, yeah.
And it stuck?
It stuck. It was really a very significant political event.
And there weren't hardly any crashes of airplanes.
Right. Well, that's another story.
But there weren't, were there? I don't think. You know, if there had been, if they had fired them and then there was something that was absolutely vital and they couldn't do it, but somehow they were able to get along.
Yeah, but remember, actually, I remember flying during that time. They really cut back on the flights, and there were very significant waits in airports, so they it made it very turbulent.
Yeah, but they were going for a big
so to
picture
speak.
thing, yeah.
Yeah, but I think it was to make the message that you know, labor was no longer going to receive Washington's support, and I think that did a lot to harm the labor movement, because when they tried to organize, you know, they ran into resistance from workers who said, "What's the point? You know, you're not going to be able to do anything for us."
I can remember once we did a program. It was Mr. Raskin, H. Raskin, who wrote for the Times on labor. We did a program about that. He was really understanding, and he said they used to go down to Bell Harbor, and what the labor unions would always ask for over the industrial unions, AFL-CIO, what they always would go for each time was more. They wanted more money. They would get more money, and so they'd do that. But that this thing that we talked about earlier is that the actual production is becoming more and more, less and less, the input that the labor is making to the productive process in a ratio with other things that could be owned in a capitalist kind of way, owned, technology or what have you, it was less and less. They were contributing less and less to the overall production of goods and services. And he said that they should have, but they never did. They could have collectively bargained for having an ownership stake in the technology that was increasingly responsible for production, but all they could do was see a pattern by which they tried to get more and more for their labor, which was in a race with the technological system that was destined to replace them, and they didn't open up an alternative system for income to be distributed other than labor. And we're still in that fix now.
Yeah, we're still in the classic labor
Employment Act of
relations.
1946, and we will distribute income to the mass of the people by having employment and labor criteria jobs. And the technology is coming, and automation is coming at a rapid pace, and it's all owned by relatively few people. And the masses of people don't talk or aren't able to talk about having ownership for the mass, democratizing ownership of the technology, because we don't have a economic theoretical system that lets us see that.
Yeah, but I mean, remember Russell Long and Aesop's employees?
Well, yes, I know.
I mean, they tried. There was some attempt to try to spread ownership of corporations to employees, but it never really caught on. It was always a very marginal kind of an affair, and you know, partly because it was resisted by the labor unions. I'm not saying that the unions. I'm not saying. Yeah, I mean, you're right. The unions.
Raskin suggested they were not visionary enough to see what was coming by stressing what their skill was, and that they could have been and they should have been, and that perhaps some of our political or other economic or intellectual leadership should have been saying that this is going to be coming, that the labor input is going to become less and less. Yeah,
well, it's true. The unions in this country tended to be very conservative and not think about the broader picture, the future. They were stuck in sort of the classic capital-labor confrontational mode, which characterizes our labor relations in this country. Much different than continental Europe, where there's much more of a commonality between labor and capital. They meet once a year in Germany, let's say, or Sweden, and they work out the wage arrangements for much of the country's workers, and much more of a cooperative mode. So I think labor has been confrontational, but I think capital has also been confrontational. That capital in this country has never treated labor as an equal, and that they've created this hostile type of environment.
Well, that's been that they would clash over that kind of thing, and then your class arguments would come up and so forth, and the people that were in the disadvantaged position would be wanting to have a job where they could make money. Now the wages have gone down, the things that they've been able to get. Now you've got everybody, the young people getting jobs. They get people who are employed enough to where they're not discontented or anything. But that process by which began with the steam engine and began with the whole process of the technology being more and more and if you have a private property economy, somebody can own that. If you have a leftist critique, you say the private property is an evil institution, so rather than getting private property ownership to the democratizing ownership of that which is producing the wealth, we're still saying that people should get their income by having a labor relationship to a process that's becoming increasingly technological. And we don't have Mr. Nixon one time said we're all Keynesians now. We had Schumpeter. And then we have what is the theoretical frame by which the economics is being understood that can give advice to the political leadership? And is there a need for a new one, a vision thing, or a new way of seeing this rendezvous we have with the economic system that might move beyond productivity analysis and begin to get at some questions of the actual production of what's going on, and maybe spread some ownership of that which is actually producing the wealth, and not stressing so much the labor input to production?
Well, yeah, I think there has to be a greater spread of asset ownership in this country.
Asset ownership as opposed to a right to a job.
Yeah, but still, I think labor has to get its due. And I mean, look at this: the minimum wage. The minimum wage today
should come up.
Hey, but it's 35% below what it was in 1968 when you adjust for inflation. I mean, how is this possible? How is this possible?
Well,
I mean, how could the unions have allowed the minimum wage to drift down so much? And then we say, but this, this is part of the political economy that occurred, and you have someone like Greenspan and the Federal Reserve Board. Whenever wages start to nudge up at all, what do? They clamp down on the economy.
Well, that inflation, it hasn't shown its head yet, but there you can see it. Right. Well, that's
the biggest fear they have is wage inflation. But what is wage inflation? That means
better living standards.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And the Fed, whenever they see any wage inflation, i.e., people getting better off, first thing they do.
If the folks getting
better, exactly.
People at the top getting
capital
better off.
Capital is okay, yeah. I mean, they're there to protect capital.
But don't we have to guard against the idea of saying the people at the top will own it? Bill Gates has all that money by stock options over he owns it, right? And if we keep the idea that they're this class thing, that it's not, if it's good for Bill Gates, or if it's good for somebody who's very well off to own the technology and and everything, why isn't it good for everybody? And why do we not somehow set up a thing rather than just, increasing wages, although that's probably something good to be done and that sort of thing, or maybe even a wealth tax. I know you're interested in that there should be a wealth tax to try and get some equity through government, and that's a thing to be done. You're going to have a lot of political opposition. But to stress the idea that the democratization of the ownership of the wealth, which is creating the wealth, we should create a context where we have, instead of it being a very shallow thing, that the ownership of assets is very widespread to everybody, so that they're in keeping with the way things are increasingly, perhaps, going to be produced.
Well, that's the other potential solution, and but that it's a long way to get from someone earning $20,000-$25,000 a year. I mean, they barely getting by with that kind of money. Where are they going to get $500,000 to put into any kind of asset ownership?
That would be.
So you say, well, okay, so we'll have firms, and this gets back to the ESOP issue.
Well, not only ESOP, but the binary, the notion that there are two ways to produce everything, and we're all skewed toward giving value to labor. But it's these other things, and the people who happen to be in the happy position of owning all those things that are producing everything are getting overwhelmingly wealthy, and the owners, there's no patterns for disseminating ownership, or no patterns like, look, 20 years out, 10, 20, 30 years out, or patterns in place that is going to create that kind of a pattern so that people are getting income by the way things are actually produced. That's what I'm trying to say. We
Yeah,
don't have a
but my
it's all
problem,
what,
yeah.
Mr. Who's the Friedman or something, or monetarist or kind of thing and everything. We don't have a vision that's going to lead to equity.
No, that's true. But my problem is how you get from here to there. How do you get to a situation where you can get asset ownership to spread? And
Well, yeah, right. How do you? First of all, is it a good thing? Is it an appropriate thing? Or does it violate some idea of how things operate? Or is it immoral? Or is it something like that? Is that one thing? Is it a good thing? Is it appropriate the way things are going? And if so, what is done in order, what gets in the way of that? Most people have no collateral to put up, or they go in a bank, they can't do it, all of that. Is there some way that that could be dealt with collectively and in a political way? Mr. Bradley was reaching for some vision thing, people were reaching for a vision thing, but they're still reifying the old way in which we've done things by and large. You know, there's no vision of something new because we're stuck in the patterns of the old, is what I guess I'm trying to get at in the way the political economy is organized.
yeah, well, I think one mechanism that has been proposed, and it's actually part of our law, is something called individual development accounts. These are actually subsidized savings accounts for low-income families.
Okay.
And in fact, Clinton has proposed something similar called USA's Universal Savings Accounts. Again, these would provide some kind of subsidy to low-income families in order for them to start accumulating assets.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, the frightening thing is that there's still a significant percentage of families that don't even have a checking account.
I know. That's absolutely the truth. That's the truth. And that's what you've done, and that we've allowed this to happen and to get such disparity in the trends of that. There's nobody that's been covering that as well as you, it seems to me, in terms of following that particular issue. And for that, we all owe you a great debt of gratitude for having followed and put figures forth that show the fact that these inequalities are there. A lot of people are getting along with it. Some people even feel happy in their immediate situation. But the inequalities are there, and the trends are not good on a national scale and on a world scale. And that something is going to have to be done to deal with it. So you're stating the situation that is going to have to be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that has occurred is that homeownership has been, the homeownership rate has been basically flat, again, for 25 years.
That's been the usual ticket for
And
access
that's
into the upper
been
middle class.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. After skyrocketing from 1900 to, let's say, 1975, going from 15% of all families up to 65%. There was, and that was partly spurred by the GI Bill,
Yeah, right.
which gave subsidized mortgages.
Yeah.
We've seen virtually no increase, and that's the other way of getting asset ownership spread in this country.
Yeah, and it's not working very well. It's got a big problem. We've got a big problem. Well, listen, I tell you,
Oh,
I'm
it's
sorry.
right.
One of the problems is we run out of time. We run out of time here.
This is really amazing.
Well,
yeah.
I really thank you, and I do congratulate you enormously on the work. You've done this better than anyone else that there is that I can see that has documented this. They're very recommended to go to your book. Again, let's just show at the very end, top heavy, and it's, again, what's subtitled, Ed?
A study of the increasing inequality of wealth in America.
Okay, and he's here in New York City at the York University. Happy to bring you those perceptions. Thank you very much for coming in. We on Conversations invite you to tune in again next week. We'll come back same time. Ed Wolff, once again, thank you very much for coming in and for all your work.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Until next time. Well, on and on, you know, it's really, there's such a big subject, you know. It's such a big subject.
Yeah.
What are you working on now? You got a particular paper you're working on now?
Well, actually, I'm starting up a project with the Ford Foundation to actually try to